neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thy only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horn. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son.
Thank you. This passage is so rich we could focus the entire lesson just on this passage, and we'll still have no time to go through it all. But I like for you to picture here both the love of Abraham towards his son and also the love of God towards Abraham and his son, and towards, of course, humanity. Let me show to you some wonderful passages from Ellen White first before we go into this passage here. How many of you are familiar with the Conflict of the Ages series? Okay, you're familiar with it? The way Patriarchs and Prophets in chapter 1, the opening words begin this way: God is love. His nature, his law is love. It ever has been, it ever will be. The high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity, whose ways are everlasting, changes not. With him is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Isaiah 57:15. Every manifestation of creative power is an expression of infinite love. This is how the conflict of the ages begins, and this is how it ends. In Great Controversy, the last sentence says, the great controversy is ended. Sin and sinners are no more. The entire universe is clean. One pulse of harmony and gladness beats through the vast creation. From him who created all flow life and light and gladness throughout the realms of illimitable space. From the minutest atom to the greatest world, all things, animate and inanimate, in their unshadowed beauty and perfect joy, declare that God is love. It begins with God is love, and it ends with God is love. And in between this conflict, this drama, this great controversy, you see God's love being portrayed in magnificent ways. One of them here is Genesis 22. When God told him to sacrifice his own son, he did not really literally told him to go and kill him. It was a test, as the Bible tells us here in verse 1. It says God tested Abraham. He could have thought, well, look at all the world, the religions and the nations around me. They're requiring child sacrifice. If you remember, God of Molech, God of Chemosh, they were requiring child sacrifice and human sacrifice. And probably Abraham wondered, well, maybe my God is no different than the other gods, but that's not the case. God was trying to show to both Abraham, Isaac, and humanity that God is love. That, like it says there in verse 13, or actually verse 13. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. In other words, God will provide a substitute. And this was a substitute. And for Abraham understood better that God was going to provide something better than for humans to die. Something better than even for the blood of animals that would be sacrificed. And that something better was going to be Jesus Christ. When John saw Jesus coming and saying, "Behold the Lamb," understood then. In verse 8 says, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering." He did not truly understand how, but Abraham had faith that God would. How much more we ourselves, we don't have to look forward to what God would do for us, but we look backwards, thankfully, to what God has done for us on the cross. Look also at the parallelism between Abraham and his son, and of course God the Father and his son Jesus. God the Father loved us so much, John 3:16 says, that he gave up his son. Abraham loved his son so much, and he still was willing to give him up. Later on, of course, in Hebrews 11, verse 18, it tells us that Abraham had such a strong faith that he believed that God would even resurrect Isaac if necessary. God knew that he will resurrect his son because his son was righteous. There was no blemish in him. There was no sin on him. Even though the sin of the world was placed upon him, in himself he had no sin. Also, it tells us here that Abraham put the wood on the son's back, and carried the wood up the hill. Jesus carried the cross up the hill of Golgotha and went up there to die. The ram here says was caught into a thicket by the horns. A crown of thorns was placed on Jesus' head. The parallels between this passage and Jesus and his sacrifice are astonishing. For us looking back, we can see that all of this was portraying what Jesus was going to do for us and for humanity. Much more, even the angels desires to look in the plan of salvation, also Paul tells us. And even them, when God showed Abraham the plan of salvation to a greater depth, even them understood even much more the plan of salvation. God will provide, the place was called later on in verse 14. It says, Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, as it is to this day. In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. In Hebrew is Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. And from the beginning in Genesis, God told Adam and Eve, I will provide. I will provide the seed of the woman to come later on and take the place of humanity and rescue all those that are willing, through by faith in Jesus, rescue them from sin. It is amazing to look at how much God was trying to demonstrate his love towards us. Even Romans chapter 5 verse 8 says, God demonstrated his love towards us, that while we were not righteous, not loving God, not willing to obey him, while we were sinners, he died for us. Here Abraham and Isaac were willing to go forward with the requirements of God. God the Father and Jesus were willing to go forward in spite of it all. Even though when Jesus was on the cross, the disciples abandoned him. The Jewish leaders were mocking him. The Romans nailed him on the cross. People were making fun of him. And through it all, Jesus loved us so much that he died for us. That is the love of God to a greater depth that we could ever understand. That's why it will take for us eternity to study the love of God and the plan of salvation. We know now dimly, darkly, as looking through a glass, but then we will see and understand to a greater depth when we go to heaven. So now that we understand a little bit better the love of God demonstrated to us through the symbolism that Abraham and his son showed to us in Genesis 22, what about death? Dealing with death on the Wednesday's lesson. One of the things that it's interesting that the lesson also tells us here, the lesson tells us we often say that death is just part of life. Have you ever heard people say that? Well, death is just part of life. Isn't that more of a contradiction? Life and death. Death is part of life. Can the two mingle, be part of each other? Or is death an enemy? Is death an intruder in the life that God really designed for us to have, which was eternal? Not to have life for 70, 80, 90, 100, whatever amount of years. Now, let's look in a few passages with me, please, if you can open your scriptures. Genesis 2, verse 15 and 17. Anyone else would like to read this passage? Genesis 2, verse 15 and 17. Okay, right there.
Then the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat